My name is Marcus Sullivan, and I've been building things since I was 8 years old. Started with my grandfather's tool shed in Akron, Ohio, where he taught me that every nail had a purpose and every measurement mattered. By the time I was 16, I could frame a house faster than most grown men. College wasn't really an option. My father worked the steel mills, and we needed the money, so I went straight into construction right after high school. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The early years were tough, really tough. I worked for small contractors who paid under the table and treated workers like disposable equipment. 12-hour days in the blazing summer heat, then more 12-hour days in the bitter Cleveland winters. My hands were permanently stained with concrete dust, and my back ached every morning before I even got out of bed. But I had something most of the other guys didn't. I could see the big picture. While they were focused on their individual tasks, I was studying how everything fit together. I'd stay after hours, not for overtime pay, but to understand the electrical systems, the plumbing, the HVAC integration. I read every technical manual I could get my hands on, subscribed to engineering journals with my own money, and pestered the architects with questions until they either answered me or threw me off the job site. The breakthrough came when I was 26. I was working on a commercial project downtown, and the structural engineer made a critical error in his calculations. The load distribution was completely wrong, the kind of mistake that could bring down a building. I tried to tell my foreman, but he brushed me off. "You're a hammer swinger, Sullivan. Leave the thinking to the college boys." So I went over his head. Straight to the project manager, then to the architect, then to the city inspector. Turns out I was right. The engineer had made a decimal error that would have cost the company millions in lawsuits and potentially killed dozens of people. The project was halted, the plans were redrawn, and suddenly everyone wanted to know who the construction worker was, who'd caught what 3 licensed professionals had missed. That's when Patterson and Associates came calling. Robert Patterson, David's father, offered me a position as a junior structural engineer. No college degree required, just hands-on experience and the ability to see what others missed. The pay was double what I'd been making, and for the first time in my life I had health insurance and a retirement plan. I threw myself into that job like my life depended on it, because in a way, this was my chance to prove that 20 years of swinging hammers had taught me something that couldn't be learned in a classroom. I studied engineering principles at night, took correspondence courses, and gradually worked my way up from junior engineer to senior engineer to project manager. The first heart attack hit when I was 38. I was on site at a hospital construction project, arguing with a subcontractor about foundation specifications when the chest pain started. At first, I thought it was just stress. We were 3 weeks behind schedule, and the hospital administration was breathing down our necks. But the pain got worse, radiating down my left arm, and suddenly I couldn't catch my breath. My crew wanted to call an ambulance, but I insisted on driving myself to the emergency room. Stupid decision, looking back, but I was worried about the project timeline. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Massive anterior wall myocardial infarction, fancy words for your heart nearly stopped working. They kept me in the hospital for a week, pumping me full of medications and lecturing me about stress management and diet changes. I was back at work 10 days later. The cardiologist wasn't happy about it. Dr. Jennifer Martinez had been very clear about the recovery protocol: 6 weeks of light activity, no stress, regular follow-ups, but the hospital project couldn't wait. We had critical deadlines to meet, and I was the only one who understood the complex structural modifications needed to accommodate the new MRI equipment. "Marcus, you're going to kill yourself," she warned during my 2-week follow-up appointment. "Your heart is damaged. It needs time to heal." But I didn't have time. Patterson and Associates was bidding on the biggest project in company history, a mixed-use development that would reshape the downtown skyline. If we landed that contract, it would secure everyone's jobs for the next 5 years. If we didn't, we'd be laying off half the engineering department. I worked 18-hour days for the next 6 months, developing innovative solutions, that would save the client millions in construction costs. We got the contract. The downtown project launched my reputation as one of the most skilled structural engineers in the region. Other companies tried to poach me, offering signing bonuses and equity packages, but I stayed loyal to Patterson and Associates. The second heart attack came 4 years later, during the construction phase of that same downtown project. This time I was reviewing plans in my office when the familiar chest pain started. I'd learned to recognize the warning signs, the crushing sensation, the shortness of breath, the cold sweat, but we were in the middle of a crisis. The steel contractor had installed the wrong beam specifications on floors 15 through 20, and the building inspector was threatening to shut down the entire project. I popped 3 nitroglycerin tablets and kept working. The pain subsided after about an hour, but I knew I needed to get to the hospital. I finished reviewing the corrected plans, sent them to the contractor, and then drove myself to the emergency room. Again, this time Dr. Martinez was furious. "Marcus, you had another heart attack and you waited an hour to seek treatment. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about the 47 families who depend on this project for their livelihoods," I replied. "I was thinking about the company that gave me a chance when no one else would." She ran more tests. The damage was worse this time. My ejection fraction, the percentage of blood pumped out of the heart with each beat, had dropped to 35%. Normal is 55 to 70%. I was officially in heart failure. The medications increased: beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, diuretics. I carried nitroglycerin everywhere and had a defibrillator implanted in my chest. The device was supposed to shock my heart back into rhythm if it stopped, but it also meant I couldn't work around certain electrical equipment or magnetic fields. I adapted. I had to. Patterson and Associates was growing, and my expertise was in demand. We took on larger projects, more complex challenges. I developed new techniques for reinforcing existing structures, created software programs that calculated load distributions more accurately than anything on the market, and trained a new generation of engineers. The third heart attack happened on a Saturday morning in February. I was at home, reviewing plans for a new convention center, when my chest exploded in pain. This one was different, more intense, more frightening. I couldn't stand up, couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. My wife Sarah found me collapsed on the floor of my office, clutching my chest and gasping for air. She called 911 immediately. No arguments this time about driving myself to the hospital. The paramedics worked on me for 20 minutes before they got my heart rhythm stabilized. In the ambulance, I actually flatlined for 43 seconds. They brought me back with the defibrillator, but I'd suffered significant brain oxygen deprivation. The recovery was brutal. 6 weeks in the hospital, then 3 months of cardiac rehabilitation. I had to relearn basic tasks, walking upstairs, lifting objects heavier than 5 pounds, even concentrating on complex problems. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken. When I finally returned to work, everything had changed. David Patterson had taken over most of the day-to-day operations from his father, and he had different ideas about the company's direction. He wanted to modernize, to attract younger talent, and to embrace new technology. There was nothing wrong with that vision, but it came with an unspoken message: the old guard was no longer welcome. I tried to adapt. I learned new software programs, attended seminars on sustainable construction techniques, even took a course on project management software, but I could see the writing on the wall. The younger engineers were getting the high-profile assignments. My input was no longer actively sought in planning meetings. When clients asked for me specifically, they were told I was transitioning to a consulting role. The final insult came when they hired Trevor Anderson, 22 years old, fresh out of Northwestern with a master's degree in structural engineering and a minor in business administration. He'd never set foot on a construction site, never worked with his hands, never had to explain to a contractor why his minor modification would bring down half the building, but he was young, energetic, and most importantly, he was cheap. Trevor started as my assistant, supposedly to learn from my experience, but within 6 months, He was leading his own projects. Within a year, he was being introduced to clients as the future of Patterson and Associates. He had all the latest software, the newest equipment, and the complete confidence of management. I watched him make mistakes that I'd seen 100 times before, simple errors that came from not understanding how theory translated to practice. But instead of learning from these mistakes, he'd blame the contractors, the inspectors, or the clients, and somehow, management always backed him up. The breaking point came during the Riverside Shopping Complex project. Trevor had designed a parking structure that looked impressive on paper, but had several critical flaws. The foundation design didn't account for the high water table, the steel specifications were insufficient for the projected load, and the drainage system would flood during the first heavy rain. I tried to discuss these issues with him privately, but he dismissed my concerns. "Marcus, I appreciate your old-school perspective, but we're using advanced modeling software now. The computer calculations are much more accurate than gut instincts." Gut instinct, 28 years of experience, reduced to gut instincts. So I did what I'd always done. I went over his head. I compiled a detailed report outlining the structural problems, and submitted it to David Patterson. I expected a meeting, a discussion, maybe even a thank you for catching potentially catastrophic errors. Instead, I got called into human resources. "Marcus, we're concerned about your relationship with Trevor," said Janet Walsh, the HR director. "He feels like you're undermining his authority and questioning his competence." "I'm trying to prevent a disaster," I replied. "Those parking structure plans are going to get someone killed. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now, back to where we left off. Trevor's designs have been reviewed by our senior engineering team and approved by the city building department. Your concerns appear to be unfounded. Unfounded. The same word they'd used 30 years ago when I'd caught that decimal error. The same word they'd probably use when the parking structure collapsed. But this time, I wasn't just some construction worker who could be ignored. I was a senior engineer with 3 decades of experience and a track record of successful projects. They couldn't just brush me off, or so I thought. The meeting with David Patterson was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend preparing my case, gathering documentation, and reviewing every detail of Trevor's design. I was ready to fight for what I knew was right, just as I'd been fighting for 28 years. But as I sat in that conference room watching my boss avoid eye contact while he delivered his prepared speech about restructuring and fresh perspectives, I realized that this fight was already over. They'd made their decision long before I'd walked into the room. The company I'd helped build, the place where I'd invested my health and my heart, had decided that loyalty was worth less than a cheap salary and a young face. They were replacing the man who'd worked through 3 heart attacks with a kid who'd never missed a day of work because he'd never worked hard enough to need one. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The severance package sat on my kitchen table like a death certificate. 6 months' salary, continuation of health benefits for a year, and a non-compete clause that would prevent me from working for any engineering firm within a 100-mile radius. They'd covered all their bases, made sure I couldn't take my clients or my expertise to a competitor. Sarah found me staring at the papers when she came home from her shift at the hospital. She'd been a nurse for 25 years, worked through her own share of corporate restructuring and budget cuts, but she'd never seen me like this. Broken. Defeated. "What are you going to do?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm 54 years old with a damaged heart and no college degree. Who's going to hire me?" The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up at 5:30 out of habit, shower, put on my work clothes, and then remember I had nowhere to go. The routine I'd followed for nearly 3 decades was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of empty days and mounting anxiety about our financial future. I tried to stay positive, applied for positions at other engineering firms, even though the non-compete clause limited my options. Most companies weren't interested in a man my age with my health issues. The few that were willing to interview me offered junior positions at half my previous salary. Apparently 28 years of experience meant nothing without the right piece of paper from the right university. Meanwhile, I watched from the sidelines as Trevor Anderson made his mark on Patterson and Associates. The company's social media accounts were full of photos of him at groundbreaking ceremonies, shaking hands with clients, accepting awards for innovative design solutions. The same solutions I'd developed over years of trial and error, now presented as the brilliant insights of a young engineering prodigy. The Riverside Shopping Complex project moved forward despite my warning. I drove by the construction site every few weeks, watching the parking structure take shape exactly as Trevor had designed it. The foundation work looked solid from the outside, but I knew what was lurking beneath the surface. The drainage issues wouldn't become apparent until the first major storm, and the structural problems wouldn't manifest until the building was fully loaded with cars and pedestrians. I considered calling the city building department, but what would I say? That I was a disgruntled ex-employee with concerns about a project that had already been approved. They'd dismiss me as quickly as Patterson and Associates had. 3 months after my termination, I finally found work. Not in engineering, the non-compete clause saw to that, but in construction management for a small residential contractor. The pay was a fraction of what I'd been making, but it was honest work and it felt good to be back on job sites, solving real problems with real solutions. My new boss, Frank Castellano, was a second-generation contractor who'd built his reputation on quality craftsmanship and fair dealing. He knew my history with Patterson and Associates, knew about my health issues, and hired me anyway. Not out of pity, but because he recognized that experience had value even in an industry increasingly obsessed with youth and technology. "You know what your problem is, Marcus," he said during my first week on the job. "You spent too many years in offices, dealing with corporate politics and PowerPoint presentations. You forgot that construction is about building things that last, not impressing clients with fancy software." He was right. Working with Frank's crew reminded me why I'd fallen in love with construction in the first place. These guys were skilled tradesmen who took pride in their work. They didn't need computer models to tell them if a wall was plumb or if a joint was properly secured. They could feel it in their hands, see it with their eyes, trust their instincts built from years of experience. But the physical demands were harder than I'd anticipated. My heart condition had progressed since the third attack, and the medications made me tired and occasionally dizzy. I had to be careful about lifting heavy objects, avoid climbing ladders, and take frequent breaks to monitor my pulse. The crew was understanding, but I could see the concern in their eyes whenever I stopped to catch my breath. The turning point came in October, during the first major rainstorm of the season. I was at home, watching the weather reports, and thinking about the various projects under construction around the city. The rain was coming down hard, 3 inches in 6 hours, and I couldn't stop thinking about the Riverside Shopping Complex. At midnight, my phone rang. It was Frank. "Marcus, you need to get down to the Riverside site right now. The parking structure is flooding." I threw on my clothes and drove through the storm to the construction site. The scene was chaos. Fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances surrounded the building. The underground parking garage was completely submerged, and water was pouring out of the structure like a broken dam. Frank met me at the perimeter fence, his face grim. "It's worse than flooding, Marcus. The foundation is shifting. The whole structure is unstable." I didn't need to get inside to know what had happened. Trevor's inadequate drainage system had failed exactly as I'd predicted. The water table had risen. The foundation couldn't handle the hydrostatic pressure, and the entire structure was compromising itself. If the building had been occupied, people would have died. The next morning, the local news was full of reports about the construction disaster at Riverside Shopping Complex. The building was condemned, the contractor was facing millions in lawsuits, and the city was launching an investigation into how such a flawed design had been approved. Trevor Anderson's name was notably absent from the news coverage. Patterson and Associates issued a statement expressing concern for public safety and promising full cooperation with the investigation. They portrayed themselves as victims of a contractor who'd failed to follow proper construction procedures. I knew better. I'd kept copies of all my communications with Trevor, including the detailed report I'd submitted to David Patterson outlining the structural problem. I'd also documented every conversation, every meeting, every attempt to address the safety concerns. The evidence was overwhelming, but I also knew that going public would be career suicide. The construction industry was small, and word traveled fast. If I exposed Patterson and Associates, I'd be labeled a whistleblower, a troublemaker, someone who couldn't be trusted to keep company secrets. No one would hire me, and my non-compete clause would ensure I couldn't work in engineering until I was nearly 60. Sarah disagreed. You have to speak up, Marcus. People could have been killed, and if I do speak up, we'll lose the house, I replied. Frank's business is small. He can't afford to keep paying me if I become a liability. So you're going to let them get away with it? I didn't have a good answer. The ethical thing to do was obvious, but the practical consequences were terrifying. I'd already lost one career to corporate politics. I couldn't afford to lose another. The investigation dragged on for months. City inspectors reviewed the plans, interviewed the construction crew, and analyzed the structural failure. The contractor was found liable for deviations from approved specifications, which was bureaucratic language for "we need someone to blame," and it's not going to be the city officials who approved the flawed design. Patterson and Associates emerged from the investigation with their reputation intact. They'd followed proper procedures, submitted plans that met city requirements, and couldn't be held responsible for construction defects. Trevor Anderson was quietly transferred to a different department, and the company hired a new senior engineer, another young graduate with impressive credentials and no real-world experience. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, knowing I had the evidence to expose the truth, but lacking the courage to use it. Every day, I told myself I was protecting my family, securing our future, being practical. But deep down I knew I was just afraid. The fear wasn't entirely unfounded. Word had already gotten out that I'd been difficult at Patterson and Associates, that I'd questioned the judgment of younger engineers and resisted new technology. The construction industry was changing, and there wasn't much room for old-school engineers who prioritized experience over education. I threw myself into Frank's projects, trying to prove that I still had value. We built beautiful homes, solid, well-designed structures that would last for generations. But they were small projects, nothing like the massive commercial developments I'd once managed. I was using a fraction of my skills, solving problems I could have handled in my sleep 20 years ago. The financial stress was constant. We'd downsized from our 4-bedroom house to a 2-bedroom apartment, sold one of our cars and canceled our vacation plans. Sarah picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working nights and weekends to make up for my reduced income. We were surviving, but barely. My health continued to deteriorate. The stress of unemployment, the physical demands of construction work, and the guilt over the Riverside situation took their toll. I had another minor cardiac event in December, not a full heart attack, but enough to land me in the emergency room for observation. Dr. Martinez was blunt about my prognosis. Marcus, your heart is failing. The ejection fraction is down to 28%. You need to consider disability retirement. I can't afford to retire, I replied. I've got mortgage payments, medical bills, and a wife who's working herself to death trying to keep us afloat. And you'll have a dead husband if you don't slow down, she shot back. Your body is sending you clear signals. You need to listen. But I couldn't listen. Couldn't afford to listen. I was caught in a trap of my own making. Too sick to work at full capacity, too proud to accept charity, too scared to risk what little security I had left. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire career building structures designed to last, creating things that would outlive their creator. But I'd failed to build the one thing that mattered most, a sustainable career that could weather the storms of corporate politics and age discrimination. As winter turned to spring, I found myself wondering if I'd made the right choices. Maybe I should have gone to college, gotten that piece of paper that would have protected me from replacement. Maybe I should have started my own company, built something that couldn't be taken away by corporate restructure. Maybe I should have spoken up about the Riverside project, consequences be damned, but maybe was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had to deal with the reality of my situation, a 54-year-old man with a failing heart, limited options, and a young competitor who'd taken everything I'd spent my life building. The real question wasn't whether I'd made mistakes, the question was what I was going to do about them. And as I watched Trevor Anderson's career flourish while mine crumbled, I began to realize that my story was far from over. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in conference rooms or construction sites. Sometimes they're fought in the quiet moments, when you have to decide who you really are, and what you're willing to sacrifice for the things you believe in. I was about to find out exactly what I was made of. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in April, while I was reviewing blueprints for a custom home Frank's crew was building in the suburbs. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, crisp, professional, with a hint of a Boston accent. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Catherine Morrison from the law firm of Morrison, Blake & Associates. I represent the families affected by the Riverside shopping complex incident. I'd like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." My heart rate spiked, and not from my medical condition. Someone had connected me to the Riverside disaster. Someone knew I'd tried to warn Patterson and Associates about the structural problems. The question was, how much did they know, and what did they want from me? "I'm not sure I can help you," I said carefully. "I haven't worked for Patterson and Associates in over a year, Mr. Sullivan. We have reason to believe you possess information crucial to our case, information that could prevent future tragedies and ensure justice for our clients. I think you'll want to hear what we have to say." We met the following Thursday at Morrison's downtown office. Catherine Morrison was exactly what I'd expected, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from winning cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Her conference room overlooked the city skyline, including the condemned shell of the Riverside shopping complex. "Mr. Sullivan, let me be direct," she began, sliding a thick folder across the polished mahogany table. "We know you submitted a detailed engineering report to Patterson and Associates, identifying critical flaws in the Riverside parking structure design. We know your warnings were ignored, and we know you were terminated shortly after raising these concerns." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. Inside were copies of my emails to Trevor Anderson, my formal report to David Patterson, and even transcripts of meetings I'd attended. Someone inside Patterson and Associates had been documenting everything, building a case against the company from within. "How did you get these?" I asked, a concerned employee who felt the public deserved to know the truth. Someone who witnessed the cover-up firsthand and couldn't live with the consequences. The concerned employee turned out to be Janet Walsh, the HR director who'd lectured me about undermining Trevor's authority. Apparently her conscience had gotten the better of her after the Riverside collapse. She'd been quietly copying documents and recording conversations for months, building an ironclad case against the company that had employed her for 15 years. "The city investigation was a whitewash," Morrison explained. "They needed a scapegoat, so they blamed the contractor for construction defects. But you and I both know the real problem was the design itself. Trevor Anderson created a death trap, and Patterson and Associates signed off on it, despite your explicit warnings. The evidence was overwhelming." Morrison's team had forensic engineers who'd analyzed the wreckage, hydrologists who'd modeled the drainage failures, and structural experts who'd confirmed my original assessment. The parking structure had been doomed from the moment Trevor's plans were approved. "We're filing a lawsuit against Patterson and Associates for gross negligence and willful misconduct," Morrison continued. "But we need you to testify. Your expertise and documentation are the key to proving they knew the design was flawed and chose to proceed anyway." I stared out the window at the Riverside site, where demolition crews were slowly dismantling the failed structure. The financial cost of the disaster was approaching $50 million. The human cost, 23 people injured in the evacuation, several businesses destroyed and an entire community's trust shattered, was incalculable. "What about my non-compete clause?" I asked. "If I testify against Patterson and Associates, they'll sue me for breach of contract." "Let them try," Morrison smiled grimly. "We'll argue that your obligation to public safety supersedes any corporate agreement. Besides, they'll have bigger problems to worry about than your employment contract." The decision wasn't easy. Testifying would mean burning bridges I could never rebuild, making enemies in an industry where reputation was everything. But it would also mean telling the truth about what happened at Riverside, ensuring that Trevor Anderson and David Patterson faced consequences for their reckless decisions. Sarah was surprisingly supportive when I told her about Morrison's offer. "You've been carrying this guilt for months," she said. Maybe it's time to do the right thing regardless of the cost. The right thing. Such a simple concept, but so complicated in practice. I'd spent my entire career doing the right thing, catching errors, preventing disasters, protecting public safety, and where had it gotten me? Unemployed, broke, and watching incompetent engineers take credit for my work. But this was different. This wasn't about corporate politics or career advancement. This was about accountability, about ensuring that the people responsible for the Riverside disaster couldn't hurt anyone else. I called Morrison the next morning and agreed to testify. The preparation process was intense. Morrison's team spent weeks reviewing every document, every email, every technical detail related to the Riverside project. They coached me on courtroom procedure, helped me organize my testimony, and prepared me for the aggressive cross-examination that Patterson and Associates lawyers would undoubtedly unleash. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations ran stories about the whistleblower engineer who'd tried to prevent the Riverside disaster. Construction industry publications picked up the story, analyzing the technical aspects of the case, and debating the ethics of corporate loyalty versus public safety. Patterson and Associates fought back hard. They hired the most expensive law firm in the state, and launched a coordinated media campaign to discredit my testimony. Their lawyers portrayed me as a disgruntled ex-employee seeking revenge, a bitter old man who couldn't accept being replaced by younger talent. Trevor Anderson gave several interviews defending his design, claiming that the structural failure was caused by unforeseeable weather conditions and substandard construction practices. He presented himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a dedicated professional whose innovative work was being unfairly scrutinized by competitors and malcontents. The personal attacks escalated quickly. Someone leaked my medical records to the press, highlighting my heart condition and suggesting that my judgment had been impaired by medication and stress. Anonymous sources within Patterson and Associates claimed I'd been increasingly erratic in my final months with the company, questioning my mental state and professional competence. Frank Castellano stood by me throughout the media storm, but I could see the strain it was putting on his business. Potential clients were nervous about hiring a contractor associated with a high-profile lawsuit, and some of his existing projects faced increased scrutiny from building inspectors and insurance companies. Maybe I should step away from your company until this is over, I suggested during one particularly difficult week. Like hell, Frank replied. You're the best engineer I've ever worked with, and I'm not letting some corporate vultures chase you away. Besides, they're scared. Why else would they be attacking you personally instead of defending their work? He was right. Patterson and Associates was fighting like a company with everything to lose. Their reputation, their client base, their entire business model depended on maintaining the facade that they were competent professionals who prioritized safety above all else. My testimony threatened to expose them as reckless profiteers who'd gambled with public safety and law. The trial began in September, almost exactly 1 year after the Riverside collapse. The courthouse was packed with reporters, attorneys, and family members of the people injured in the evacuation. Outside, protesters held signs demanding accountability for corporate negligence and reform of the building inspection process. Morrison's opening statement was devastating. She walked the jury through the timeline of events, from Trevor's flawed initial design, to my repeated warnings to the company's decision to proceed despite knowing the risks. She presented emails, reports, and technical analyses that painted a clear picture of corporate malfeasance. Patterson and Associates' defense strategy was predictable but effective. Their lawyers argued that I was a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta, that my concerns had been properly evaluated and addressed, and that the structural failure was caused by factors beyond their control. I brought in their own expert witnesses, impressive credentials, polished presentations, but no real-world experience with the kinds of problems that had doomed the Riverside project. My testimony lasted 3 days. Morrison guided me through my background, my experience with Patterson and Associates, and the specific technical issues I'd identified with Trevor's design. I explained how the inadequate drainage system would cause flooding, how the foundation couldn't handle the hydrostatic pressure, and how the structural elements were insufficient for the projected loads. The cross-examination was brutal. Patterson and Associates' lead attorney, a silver-haired shark named William Hartley, attacked every aspect of my testimony. He questioned my qualifications, my motives, and my mental state. He suggested that my heart condition had impaired my judgment, that my age had made me resistant to new technologies, and that my termination was justified by my inability to work collaboratively with younger colleagues. "Miss Sullivan," Hartley said during one particularly aggressive exchange, "isn't it true that you were jealous of Mr. Anderson's rapid advancement within the company, envious of his education and his innovative approaches to structural engineering?" "I was concerned about public safety," I replied. "My feelings about Mr. Anderson were irrelevant compared to the lives that were at risk." "But you admit you resented being replaced by a younger engineer." "I resented being replaced by an incompetent engineer. His age was irrelevant." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge called for order. Hartley had gotten the reaction he wanted, but I'd managed to get my point across. This wasn't about age discrimination or wounded pride. This was about competence and accountability. Trevor Anderson's testimony was a disaster for the defense. Despite months of coaching, he came across as arrogant and defensive. When Morrison questioned him about the technical aspects of his design, his answers were vague and unconvincing. He relied heavily on computer modeling and theoretical calculations, but couldn't explain how those models translated to real-world conditions. "Mr. Anderson," Morrison asked, "did you ever personally inspect a flooded basement before designing the riverside drainage system?" "I relied on industry-standard modeling software," he replied. "That's not what I asked. Have you ever personally witnessed the effects of hydrostatic pressure on a foundation? The software accounts for all relevant factors. Have you ever worked on a construction site during a major storm? I don't see how that's relevant to my qualifications as an engineer. Have you ever had to explain to a family why their home flooded because of inadequate drainage?" Hartley objected, but the damage was done. Trevor's inexperience was on full display, and the jury could see the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical understanding. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. The jury found Patterson and Associates liable for gross negligence and awarded the plaintiffs $42 million in damages. More importantly, they issued a statement emphasizing the need for experienced oversight in structural engineering and criticizing the company's decision to ignore safety warnings from qualified professionals. The media coverage was extensive and largely favorable. Engineering publications ran editorials about the importance of experience in complex projects. Safety organizations used the case as an example of why whistleblower protections needed to be strengthened. Construction companies began reviewing their own quality control procedures to avoid similar disasters. Patterson and Associates declared bankruptcy within 6 months. David Patterson sold the company's assets to pay the judgment and dissolved the firm that his father had built over 4 decades. Trevor Anderson found new employment with a smaller firm, but his reputation was permanently damaged. He'd learned an expensive lesson about the difference between classroom theory and real-world consequences. For me, the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but at enormous personal cost. The media attention had made me unemployable in the traditional engineering market, and the stress of the trial had taken a serious toll on my health. I'd had another cardiac episode during the proceedings, and Dr. Martinez was insisting that I consider disability retirement. But something unexpected had emerged from the wreckage of my career. During the trial, I'd been contacted by several small engineering firms and construction companies who were impressed by my testimony and wanted to hire me as a consultant. They weren't looking for someone to manage massive projects or compete with young hotshots. They wanted experience, wisdom, and the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be taught in school. Frank Castellano was the first to make a formal offer. "How would you like to be my chief engineer?" he asked. "We're expanding into commercial projects, and I need someone who knows how to build things right the first time." It wasn't the career I'd planned, but it was the career I'd earned. No more corporate politics, no more PowerPoint presentations, no more watching incompetent managers make decisions that endangered lives, just honest work, fair compensation, and the satisfaction of building structures that would stand the test of time. As I sat in Frank's office, reviewing plans for our first major commercial project, a community center that would serve families for generations, I realized that my story wasn't about failure or betrayal. It was about resilience, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the cost seems unbearable. I'd worked through 3 heart attacks and lived to tell about it. More importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can build isn't a structure made of steel and concrete. Sometimes it's a reputation based on truth, competence, and unwavering commitment to doing the right thing. The young engineers could keep their software and their degrees and their corporate ladder climb. I had something they couldn't buy or download or fake: the knowledge that comes from a lifetime of building things that matter, and the strength that comes from surviving every attempt to tear you down. The engineering license arrived on a crisp November morning, 3 months after the trial ended. I stared at the official document, signed by the State Board of Professional Engineers, certifying me as a licensed professional engineer, based on my extensive experience and the special provisions for practitioners who demonstrated exceptional competence without traditional academic credentials. It was a piece of paper I should have pursued decades earlier, but back then I'd been too busy building things to worry about credentials. Now, at 55, with a failing heart and a reputation forged in courtroom fire, that license represented something more valuable than any college degree: official recognition that experience counted for something in a world increasingly obsessed with youth and technology. Frank Castellano was waiting in his office when I arrived at work, grinning like he'd won the lottery. "Marcus, I just got off the phone with the community center board. They want us to expand the project. Not just the main building, they want us to design and build an entire complex: recreation center, senior housing, medical clinic, the works." The Riverside Community Center project had started as a simple replacement for a structure damaged in a fire, but our initial designs had impressed the board so much that they'd secured additional funding for a comprehensive redevelopment of the entire neighborhood. It was the kind of project I'd dreamed about managing during my years at Patterson and Associates: complex, meaningful, and built to serve the community for generations. "There's just one catch," Frank continued. "They want you to be the lead engineer on the entire project. Your name on the plans, your seal on the permits. They specifically requested you after seeing your testimony in the Patterson trial." I felt my pulse quicken, but for once it wasn't from cardiac stress. It was excitement, the same feeling I'd had 40 years ago when I'd first learned to read blueprints in my grandfather's workshop. This was my chance to build something significant, something that would outlast corporate politics and industry trends. The project consumed the next 2 years of my life. Working with Frank's expanded team, I designed structures that balanced innovation with practicality, beauty with functionality. The main community center featured soaring spaces that encourage social interaction, while the senior housing incorporated accessibility features I'd learned about during my own health struggles. But the real innovation was in the details that other engineers might have overlooked. The foundation system was designed to handle the area's clay soil conditions, based on my experience with dozens of similar sites. The mechanical systems were laid out for easy maintenance, recognizing that community centers operated on tight budgets. The structural elements were oversized for their immediate needs, allowing for future expansion without major reconstruction. Every decision was informed by 3 decades of watching buildings succeed and fail, of understanding how theoretical designs translated to real-world performance. I wasn't the fastest engineer or the most technologically sophisticated, but I knew how to build things that worked. The contrast with my former colleagues at Patterson and Associates was striking. The firm's bankruptcy had scattered its employees across the industry, with mixed results. David Patterson had moved to Florida and opened a small consulting practice, while several of the younger engineers had found positions with larger firms where their computer skills were valued over their practical experience. Trevor Anderson had landed at Morrison Engineering, ironically, a company founded by Catherine Morrison's husband before she'd pursued her legal career. His new employers clearly valued his technical credentials over his judgment, and he'd been assigned to design another major commercial project downtown. I heard about Trevor's new assignment through Frank, who had connections throughout the local construction industry. The project was a 40-story mixed-use tower that would be the tallest building in the city's history. Complex foundation work, innovative structural systems, aggressive timeline, exactly the kind of high-profile challenge that ambitious young engineers crave. He's using some new computer modeling system, Frank reported, claims it can calculate wind loads and seismic forces more accurately than anything on the market. The architects are calling it a revolutionary approach to super tall construction. I didn't comment, but I remembered Trevor's faith in computer models during the Riverside project. Software was a tool, not a substitute for understanding. No computer program could account for the subtle factors that determined whether a building would succeed or fail. Soil conditions that varied from boring to boring, weather patterns that deviated from historical norms, construction tolerances that depended on human skill and attention to detail. My own project was progressing smoothly but not without challenges. The community center's design required careful coordination between multiple building systems, and Frank's crew was learning to work on a scale they'd never attempted before. I spent most of my time on site, solving problems in real time and ensuring that the construction matched the plans. The physical demands were manageable if I was careful about pacing myself. I'd learned to recognize the warning signs of cardiac stress and had developed strategies for managing my energy levels. Morning site visits when I was freshest, afternoon office work when I needed to rest, and regular breaks to monitor my vital signs. Martinez was cautiously optimistic about my health. The stress of the trial had initially worsened my condition, but the satisfaction of meaningful work seemed to be having a positive effect. My ejection fraction had stabilized, and the frequency of irregular heartbeats had decreased. I was far from healthy, but I was functional. "You've found your sweet spot," she observed during one of my quarterly checkups. "Challenging work that doesn't overwhelm your physical limitations. This is probably the best outcome we could have hoped for." The sweet spot. I liked that description. For the first time in years, I felt like I was using my skills appropriately, building something valuable without sacrificing my health or my principles. The community center project wasn't making me rich, but it was making me proud. The media attention from the Patterson trial had brought unexpected opportunities. Engineering schools started inviting me to speak about professional ethics and the importance of experience in design decisions. Construction industry organizations asked me to serve on safety committees and review panels. Professional journals published my articles about the practical aspects of structural engineering. I wasn't seeking the spotlight, but I recognized the platform's value. Young engineers needed to understand that computer models and theoretical knowledge were just starting points. Real competence came from understanding how buildings behaved in the real world, how materials responded to stress and weather and time. One speaking engagement stood out particularly. The State University's engineering school had invited me to address their graduating class about career development and professional responsibility. As I looked out at the audience of 20-something faces, I saw echoes of my younger self, eager, confident, certain that their education had prepared them for any challenge. "You're about to enter an industry that values speed over safety, profit over prudence," I told them. "You'll be pressured to cut corners, ignore warning signs, and defer to managers who don't understand the technical implications of their decisions. The question isn't whether you'll face these pressures, it's how you'll respond when you do." I talked about the Riverside project, about the temptation to stay silent when speaking up might cost your job. I explained how corporate loyalty could conflict with professional responsibility, and how the easiest path wasn't always the right path. "Your education has given you tools," I concluded, "but wisdom comes from experience, and integrity comes from choice. Don't let anyone convince you that being young means being expendable, or that being experienced means being obsolete. The industry needs both innovation and judgment, enthusiasm and wisdom." The response was overwhelming. Students lined up afterward to ask questions, share their concerns, and seek advice about navigating their early career. Several professors approached me about developing a course on practical engineering applications, bridging the gap between classroom theory and real-world practice. but the most meaningful response came from an unlikely source. Trevor Anderson was waiting in the parking lot when I left the university, leaning against a silver BMW that probably cost more than most people made in a year. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand, "I heard your talk. It was illuminating." I studied his face, looking for signs of sarcasm or manipulation. Trevor had aged in the 2 years since the trial, stress lines around his eyes, gray showing at his temples. The cocky young engineer had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd learned some hard lesson. "I owe you an apology," he continued. "I was arrogant and dismissive, and people got hurt because of my mistakes. I should have listened to your warnings about Riverside." The apology caught me off guard. I'd expected continued animosity, not contrition. "What changed your mind?" "My new project," he admitted. "The 40-story tower downtown. I've been working on it for 18 months. And I keep finding problems that the computer models didn't predict. Soil conditions that don't match the boring logs, wind patterns that don't follow the theoretical calculations, construction tolerances that affect the structural performance." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I've been trying to solve these problems on my own, but I'm in over my head. The building is scheduled to open in 6 months, and I'm not confident it's safe." The admission took courage. Trevor's career was already damaged by the Riverside disaster, and acknowledging problems with his new project could destroy what remained of his professional reputation. But he was asking for help, recognizing that his pride wasn't worth the potential consequences. "Show me the plans," I said. We spent the next 3 hours in Trevor's office, reviewing his designs and calculations. The problems were subtle but serious. The kind of issues that came from relying too heavily on theoretical models and not enough on practical experience. The foundation design assumed uniform soil conditions that didn't exist. The wind load calculations didn't account for the surrounding building's effects. The connection details looked impressive on paper but would be difficult to execute properly in the field. "This isn't unfixable," I told him, "but it's going to require significant modification. And you're going to need help from someone who's dealt with these issues before." Trevor nodded. "Would you consider consulting on the project? I know it's awkward, given our history, but I don't trust anyone else to get it right." The irony wasn't lost on me. The young engineer who'd replaced me was now asking for my help to avoid another disaster. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let him face the consequences of his inexperience, but a larger part recognized the opportunity to prevent another Riverside-scale catastrophe. "I'll help," I said, "but on one condition: no more secrets, no more hiding problems, no more hoping the issues will resolve themselves. If there's a safety concern, we address it immediately, regardless of the schedule or budget implication." Trevor agreed, and we spent the following months working together to redesign critical elements of the tower project. It was a strange partnership, the old engineer and the young one, the whistleblower and the company man, experience and education finally working toward the same goal. The collaboration was more successful than either of us had expected. Trevor's technical skills complemented my practical knowledge, and his computer modeling capabilities helped validate my intuitive assessment. We developed solutions that neither of us could have created alone, innovations that balanced theoretical elegance with real-world functionality. More importantly, Trevor proved to be a quick learner when his ego wasn't getting in the way. He asked thoughtful questions, challenged my assumptions respectfully, and gradually developed the kind of practical judgment that couldn't be taught in school. By the time the tower project was completed, he'd become the kind of engineer I could trust to make good decisions under pressure. The building opened on schedule and under budget, with none of the problems that had plagued the Riverside project. The success earned Trevor redemption in the eyes of the industry, and gave me satisfaction that went beyond professional validation. I'd helped prevent a disaster while teaching a young engineer the lessons I'd learned over 3 decades of building experience. Standing in the tower's lobby during the grand opening ceremony, watching families and business owners celebrate the completion of their new landmark, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with my own career achievement. This was what engineering was supposed to be about: bringing people together, creating spaces where communities could thrive, building structures that would serve future generations. Frank found me in the crowd, grinning as he watched city officials praise the project's innovative design and successful execution. "You know," he said, "we've got 3 more major projects lined up for next year. Word is getting around that Castellano Construction knows how to build things right." I nodded, already thinking about the challenges and opportunities those projects would bring. At 57, with a damaged heart and a reputation built on surviving corporate warfare, I was busier and more fulfilled than I'd been in years. The path hadn't been what I'd planned, but it had led me to exactly where I needed to be. The industry was changing, and there would always be pressure to prioritize speed over safety, profit over quality. But as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, willing to share their experience with the next generation, willing to build things that lasted, there was hope. I'd worked through 3 heart attacks and lived to tell the story. More importantly, I'd learned that survival wasn't just about enduring the bad times, it was about finding meaning in the struggle, building something valuable from the wreckage, and passing on the wisdom that came from refusing to give up. The rookie had taught the veteran that it was never too late to learn, and the veteran had taught the rookie that some lessons could only be learned through experience, failure, and the courage to try again. 5 years later, I stood in the gleaming lobby of the Marcus Sullivan Center for Engineering Excellence, watching the first class of students file into the lecture hall for their inaugural session. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who'd never earned a college degree now had an entire academic center named in his honor, funded by settlements from the Patterson and Associates lawsuit and donations from construction companies who'd learned the value of experience the hard way. The university had approached me 18 months earlier with an ambitious proposal: create a program that bridged the gap between theoretical engineering education and practical application. They wanted to produce graduates who could think both analytically and intuitively, who understood that every calculation had real-world consequences, who could spot problems that computers couldn't predict. "We're calling it the Applied Engineering Ethics and Practice Program," Dean Jennifer Harrison had explained during our initial meeting. "Traditional engineering education teaches students how to solve problems on paper. We want to teach them how to solve problems in the real world, where the stakes are measured in lives, not grades." The program was revolutionary by academic standards. Students would spend equal time in classrooms and on construction sites, learning from both professors and master craftsmen. They'd study famous engineering failures alongside successful projects, analyzing what went wrong and why. Most importantly, they'd learn to question their own assumptions and seek input from experienced practitioners before making critical decisions. Trevor Anderson had been instrumental in developing the curriculum. His transformation from arrogant rookie to thoughtful professional had made him an ideal candidate to teach the next generation about the balance between innovation and prudence. He now served as an assistant professor in the program, bringing both technical expertise and hard-won wisdom to his students. "Marcus," he said, approaching me before the first lecture began, "I've been thinking about what to tell them today." "How do you condense 30 years of experience into a single lesson?" "You don't," I replied. "You start with the most important truth and build from there, which is that engineering isn't about being right, it's about being responsible." The first class was a mixed group, 24 students, ranging from recent graduates to mid-career professionals, seeking additional credentials. Some had been attracted by the program's innovative approach, others by the promise of working with industry veterans who'd been through real crises. All of them seemed to understand that traditional engineering education was missing something crucial. My opening lecture focused on the Riverside shopping complex disaster, not as a cautionary tale about corporate malfeasance, but as an example of how technical knowledge without practical wisdom could lead to catastrophic failure. I walked them through Trevor's original design, explaining how each decision had seemed reasonable in isolation, but had combined to create a perfect storm of structural vulnerabilities. "Engineering is about managing uncertainty," I told them. "You'll never have perfect information, unlimited budgets, or ideal conditions. Your job is to make the best decisions possible with incomplete data, then monitor the results and adjust accordingly. Humility isn't weakness in an engineer, it's a survival skill." The questions that followed were sharp and engaged. These students had already encountered the limitations of theoretical knowledge in their previous work or studies. They wanted to know how to recognize when their calculations might be wrong, how to balance conflicting requirements, how to communicate technical risks to non-technical decision makers. One student, a woman named Rachel Martinez, who'd worked as a structural drafter before returning to school, raised her hand. "Mr. Sullivan, how do you know when to trust your instincts over the computer models?" "Experience," I answered. "But since you don't have 30 years to accumulate that experience, you need to learn from people who do." That's what this program is about. Compressing decades of practical knowledge into an educational framework that prepares you for real-world challenges. The program's reputation grew quickly. Within 2 years, we had applications from students across the country and partnerships with construction companies eager to hire graduates who understood both theory and practice. Major engineering firms began sending their junior staff for continuing education, recognizing that technical skills alone weren't sufficient for complex projects. My role evolved from instructor to program director to something approaching elder statesman of the industry. Professional organizations invited me to keynote conferences, trade publications featured my articles on engineering education, and government agencies consulted me on infrastructure safety standards. The kid who'd started swinging hammers in his grandfather's workshop had somehow become a respected voice in national engineering policy. But the real satisfaction came from watching my students succeed in their careers. Rachel Martinez joined a firm specializing in seismic retrofitting and quickly gained recognition for her ability to spot potential problems that others missed. Another graduate, James Park, was hired by a major construction company specifically because of his understanding of how design decisions affected field operations. Trevor had become more than a colleague, he'd become a genuine friend. Our collaboration had taught both of us valuable lessons about the relationship between experience and innovation. He'd learned to question his assumptions and seek input from practitioners. I'd learned to appreciate new technologies that could enhance rather than replace traditional engineering judgment. "You know what's funny?" he said one afternoon, as we reviewed applications for the program's 4th class. "5 years ago, I thought experience was just another word for being stuck in the past. Now I realize it's the foundation for building the future." The observation was particularly relevant as we prepared for our most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive study of infrastructure resilience funded by the National Science Foundation. The research would examine how structures performed during extreme weather events, analyzing the factors that determined whether buildings survived or failed when conditions exceeded their design parameters. Frank Castellano's company had grown alongside my academic career. What had started as a small residential contractor was now a mid-sized firm specializing in complex commercial projects, with particular expertise in adaptive reuse and sustainable construction. Frank had embraced the principles we'd developed in the academic program, creating a company culture that valued both innovation and experience. "Marcus, I've got something I want to show you," he said, leading me to his office one December morning. On his desk was an architectural rendering of a new hospital complex, complete with emergency facilities, research laboratories, and patient housing. "They want us to lead the engineering team for the entire project." The hospital commission represented everything we'd worked toward, a major public works project that would serve the community for generations, with sufficient budget and timeline to do the work properly. More importantly, the selection committee had specifically requested our team because of our reputation for combining innovative design with practical construction knowledge. "There's just one catch," Frank continued. "They want you to serve as the chief consulting engineer. Your name on the plans, your seal on the permits, your responsibility for the entire structural system." I studied the renderings, noting the complex foundation requirements, the specialized equipment loads, and the seismic considerations that would make this project particularly challenging. At 62, with my heart condition carefully managed but still present, this would likely be the capstone project of my career. "When do we start?" I asked. The hospital project consumed the next 3 years, but in the best possible way. Working with a talented team of young engineers educated in our program, I was able to apply everything I'd learned about balancing innovation with prudence, theory with practice, efficiency with safety. The design incorporated cutting-edge materials and construction techniques, but every innovation was thoroughly tested and carefully implemented. We used advanced computer modeling, but validated the results with physical testing and expert review. We met aggressive budget and schedule targets, but never at the expense of quality or safety. Most importantly, we approached every decision with the kind of collaborative humility that I'd tried to instill in my students. When questions arose, we sought input from multiple sources. When problems emerged, we addressed them transparently. When conflicts developed between different requirements, we worked together to find solutions that served the project's ultimate purpose. The hospital opened to national acclaim, not just for its architectural beauty or technological sophistication, but for its innovative approach to combining advanced engineering with practical functionality. Medical professionals praised the efficient layouts that improved patient care, while construction professionals studied the building techniques that had achieved complex results with relatively simple methods. Standing in the hospital's main atrium during the dedication ceremony, surrounded by my former students, current colleagues, and industry peers, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional achievement. This building would serve thousands of patients over the coming decades, providing healing and hope to people facing their own health crises. Dr. Martinez found me in the crowd, approaching with the warm smile I'd come to associate with good news during our regular checkup. "Marcus, I have to tell you something. When you first came to me 15 years ago after your third heart attack, I didn't think you'd live to see 60. Now you're 65. You've accomplished more in the past decade than most people achieve in their entire careers, and your cardiac function is better than it's been in years." "What changed?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "You found your purpose," she replied. "You stopped fighting against your limitations and started working within them. You discovered that meaning matters more than money, that building something lasting is more satisfying than climbing corporate ladders." She was right. The heart attacks that had seemed like career-ending disasters had actually freed me to pursue work that truly mattered. Being replaced by a 22-year-old rookie had forced me to discover my real value wasn't in competing with younger engineers, but in mentoring them and sharing the knowledge that could only be gained through experience. The industry continued to evolve, with new technologies, new materials, and new challenges that required fresh thinking and innovative approaches. But the fundamental principles remained constant. Structures had to be safe, functional, and durable. Engineers had to be humble, responsible, and committed to serving the public interest. And experience, the kind that came from building things, watching them succeed or fail, and learning from both outcomes, remained as valuable as ever. My retirement from active practice came gradually rather than abruptly. I stepped back from day-to-day project management, while maintaining my role in the academic program and serving as a consultant on complex projects. Trevor Anderson took over as the primary liaison between the university program and industry partners, while Rachel Martinez was promoted to lead engineer at Frank's company. The transition felt natural rather than forced. I wasn't being pushed aside by younger competitors. I was choosing to focus my remaining energy on the activities that provided the greatest satisfaction and impact: teaching, mentoring, writing, and occasional consulting on projects that particularly interested me. The final vindication came from an unexpected source: the American Society of Civil Engineers, the same organization that had once questioned my qualifications because of my lack of formal education, awarded me their highest honor for lifetime achievement in structural engineering. The citation specifically mentioned my contributions to engineering education and my role in promoting ethical practice within the profession. "Marcus Sullivan represents the finest traditions of our profession," the society president said during the awards ceremony. "He has demonstrated that wisdom comes from experience, that integrity matters more than credentials, and that the highest calling of an engineer is to serve the public good." The awards ceremony was attended by hundreds of my former students, colleagues, and industry partners. Trevor Anderson served as one of the presenters, talking about how our collaboration had taught him that mentorship was a two-way street, that even experienced engineers could learn from fresh perspectives when those perspectives were grounded in respect and humility. Frank Castellano was there, representing the construction company that had grown from a small residential contractor to a major regional firm, largely because of our partnership. Sarah was there, proud and slightly amazed, that her husband's second career had exceeded even his first in terms of recognition and impact. But the person whose presence meant the most was a young engineer named David Chen, who'd been one of my first students in the applied engineering program, and was now leading his own team on a major infrastructure project. He approached me after the ceremony with a familiar look of determination and uncertainty that I remembered from my own early career. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "I'm facing a situation where I think there might be safety issues with a design, but I'm not sure how to address them without derailing the entire project. I was hoping you could give me some advice." I smiled, recognizing the moment when experience passed from one generation to the next. "Let's find somewhere quiet to talk," I said, "and bring the plans. I want to see exactly what you're dealing with." As we walked toward a quiet corner of the reception hall, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd started as a construction worker with big dreams and ended as an educator with lasting impact. I'd survived 3 heart attacks, corporate betrayal and professional exile to find purpose in building things that mattered and teaching others to do the same. The rookie who'd replaced me had become a trusted colleague and friend. The company that had discarded me had disappeared, while the values I'd tried to instill had flourished in new institutions and new practitioners. The health crisis that had threatened to end my career had actually redirected it toward more meaningful work. I'd learned that success wasn't measured by salary or title or recognition, but by the positive impact you had on other people's lives. That wisdom wasn't something you could download or purchase, but something you earned through making mistakes and learning from them. That the most important thing you could build wasn't a structure made of steel and concrete, but a legacy of knowledge and values that would influence future generations. Looking back, I wouldn't change the path I'd taken. The heart attacks, the corporate politics, the financial struggles, the legal battles, they'd all been necessary steps in a journey that had led me to discover my true calling. I'd worked through 3 heart attacks and survived to tell the story, but more importantly, I'd learned that survival was just the beginning. The real victory was in building something that would outlast your own mortality, something that would continue to serve others long after you were gone. As I sat down with David Chen to review his engineering drawings, I realized that this was exactly where I was supposed to be, passing on hard-won knowledge to the next generation, helping them avoid the mistakes I'd made, and ensuring that the lessons I'd learned would continue to protect public safety for decades to come. The circle was complete, but the story would continue through every student I'd taught, every engineer I'd mentored, and every building that stood a little safer because someone had learned to balance innovation with experience, confidence with humility, ambition with responsibility. I'd worked through 3 heart attacks, but I'd also worked through everything that came after, and that had made all the difference. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.